And Nadine, today you're in Tokyo, is that right?
Today I'm in Tokyo. I've been in Tokyo for a few months now because of COVID, and so it's a very pleasant experience as far as I'm concerned. Yes.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to talk about part of my work today with you and with the audience.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you could join and talk about your wonderful book. Today we're talking about Nadine's book, Kotan Chronicles, selected poems from 1928 to 1943, written by Genzo Sarashina, who was a migrant living in the area where a lot of the Ainu were living. And it's really fascinating history and heritage and insight into someone who is living in Hokkaido in that area during that time. So I'm so glad you could join us and share some of your insights, Nadine.
Yes, so this is actually the story of this book is quite interesting in itself because I'm a historian of modern Japan, and I was doing my PhD actually a few years ago because I joined academia after another career in journalism. But I was doing research for that, my thesis, which was on political dissent in early 20th century Japan, and I came across some of these magazines, poetry magazines, that were really roughly made, things that are put together by a group of people who are very keen and interested in what they're doing and want to express a message, but of course they don't have the means to make something very, gorgeous and certainly not commercially viable, but they had a following. Anyway, Genzo Sarashina, so Sarashina Genzo, was one of these political dissenters in the 1920s and 30s, and he was part of the so-called anarchists in the sense that they were against government authority, but not necessarily violent. It was more of a worldview, a way of life, and a worldview. And he was there in Hokkaido, a second generation migrant from the mainland. And as you say, living with or in proximity with Ainu communities. So I was doing this research and I came across a little book of poetry called Hokui Gojudo, 50th degree north latitude. So that was it's a series of poetry magazines. And you found, I mean, it's like a gem really, because you found these poems that talk about the Ainu, that talk about, of course, the natural landscape of Hokkaido. Also, a lot about poverty, because, of course, we're talking about the 1920s, 1930s, especially harsh in the countryside. The situation was especially harsh for farmers and people like him, he was a farmer, a migrant, a farmer. And of course for the Ainu. So there's this combination of themes that I thought very interesting, beautiful natural landscape, the ethnic Ainu who are being given a voice or are lending their voice to the poetry, and also Sarashina himself, who was very idealistic, in his worldview, but also struggling financially, I mean, materially, in order to make a living. So it's a very interesting combination.
Yeah, definitely. I was so interested by so many parts of the book, especially as we're talking about sustainability. It seems like Sarashina-san really learned how the Ainu respected nature in their life and their culture, and how that was very frustrating for them under kind of the restrictions of Japanese rule. And he especially saw that when he was a substitute teacher of children, and learned a lot about Ainu culture and heritage and community from what he learned while teaching the children. And he was also frustrated from the other side in the textbooks and the kind of forceful changes from the government structure on the Ainu and restrictions on how they were able to live and continue their culture, or lack of ability to continue their culture, perhaps. That was really fascinating.
Well, the history of the Ainu in Hokkaido, well, it's, officially the Ainu became part of Hokkaido as Japan, part of Japan in 1869. But before that, there had been some trade with the Japanese, so that there had been communication. But in 1869, Japan declared that Hokkaido was part of their national land, and then a process of assimilation of the Ainu started, not always very straightforward, and of course not necessarily beneficial to the Ainu, although I have to insist that it's not black and white, and of course some Ainu made the most of the situation, but the reality is that in terms of, as you say, sustainability and life among the community that value the natural world, as a primary concern, this has kind of disappeared, like it disappears in many modernizing societies. And it created some frustration and some harm and some pain, I think, among these Ainu communities whose world suddenly was changed against not of their own volition. So Sarashina Genzo had a wonderful experience. Wonderful for those of us who read about that experience later on. And it is this time he spent teaching in a children's school, a shogako, so a primary school in Hokkaido near Kushiro in the 1930s, early 1930s. And at the time, from 1899 onwards, the education between Japanese children, there was a segregation between Japanese children and Ainu children. So they were originally not allowed to go to the same schools, and they had a different curriculum, and the Ainu children were encouraged or certainly discouraged to speak Ainu language with others and at school. So that is the process of assimilation. Now, by the time Sarashina started teaching, it has been a bit relaxed, and there was a mix between Ainu children and Japanese children in these schools. But I think, yes, this experience was so wonderful because you can feel and understand through these poems that he really communicated with these children, and that the children taught him as much as he was teaching them. And there was this, again, always in the background of poverty. It's poetry and poverty, really, because life was difficult for many of these families. And you could see, talking about sustainability, how much they did with what they had, and they made the most of the little resources they could get. And one of the tragedies, perhaps, of these changes that took place within Ainu communities is that the Japanese government at the time decided that fishing, according to the old tradition of fishing, was no longer allowed. So salmon fishing, for example, was no longer allowed as it had been in the past. And of course, this is very major if you live off hunting and fishing, if you're not allowed to fish anymore the way you used to. There were restrictions. They were allowed at certain time in certain places, but certainly not like before. And you see in these poems some hints of that. You see, there's one point that says, the kites, the birds, circle around because they see all these salmon coming back from having spawned, and nobody can fish them. They're just there for the birds. So there are little hints like that. It's really interesting, I think.
It is really interesting. And let's talk a little bit about some of the language used. For example, in the title, Kotan would mean village, right? In the Ainu language. And Ainu, I was so interested to read this in your book, that Ainu just means human. So the Ainu Moshu, is
Moshir.
it? Moshir
Moshir.
means
Yeah.
human land. It was often translated as the Ainu's area, but it actually just means the land of people. And in contrast to the land of the gods, the Kamui Moshir. And I thought that was so fascinating. And so much of the stories reflect how the Ainu thought about their world and living, as many indigenous people do around the world, living in balance with nature and animals, and you know, and then being forced to change what they had learned from ancestors, and that frustration was reflected. It's really, really interesting insight that he had. And of course, he also had his own bias as a Japanese, right? And he would see some of the elders in the Ainu drinking shochu and kind of giving up on trying to fight against the rules. And so I think I saw someone write about your book that it's very sympathetic, but it's not like a romantic view of the Ainu. Like he respected them, he was sympathetic, he was empathetic, but not sentimental. And I thought that was a really interesting contrast.
Well, yes, well, I'm very glad that you point that out, because in fact, it is true that the change that goes through these to which these communities are forced to is tragic. I mean, change in itself is very often difficult to go through, and this relationship that indigenous communities have to the natural world, which is, quite obvious in a way, but in each case it has a specificity, and the Ainu traditions are actually very interesting and lovely and inspiring, very inspiring. So this is, as I say, a tragedy, but you cannot just see the tragedy in this, because, modernization is a factor for the past, well, in the case of Japan, almost 200 years, but, even more in other parts of the world. And, this happens everywhere. But I think that the role of someone like Sarashina was to document through his poetry what these changes were, the meaning, the significance of these changes for the Ainu. And you have these poems. One old Ainu says, it used to be that we could trust everything, and that we would go barefoot into the snow, but now it's no longer the same, because the shamo is the pejorative expression used for the Japanese, I was going to say invaders, but it is not the word, occupiers, or the Japanese migrants, really, who were not always kind to the indigenous people there. And so they said the Shamo have come, and now it's all a land of lies and, frustrations. But so Sarashina, as you say, was ambivalent, because, the Japanese who emigrate to Hokkaido in the late 19th century, mid-late 19th century and early 20th century, for them, it was an opportunity. So Hokkaido was the land of promises, and you had quite many samurai, for example, who had lost their status at the time of the Meiji Restoration, who moved to Hokkaido. A bit later on, you had people who'd lost everything on the mainland and thought, well, we're going to make a new start in Hokkaido. So Hokkaido for them was a land of opportunity. But someone like Sarashina was I think deep down empathetic, and he understood that, one's opportunity didn't go without someone else's loss or imposition. So he was very aware of that, but he was also aware that modernity, well, at least he was expressing the fact that modernity was unstoppable, that you couldn't go against this. And therefore he looked at the Ainu communities with sympathy, but also he thought, you've got to resist, you've got to do your own thing, or you've got to fight as a dissenter would fight at the time, to raise your fist. And he was a bit disappointed to see that some of them just fell into alcoholism rather than fighting, or that they would stick to superstitions rather than try to catch up with some different ways of living. So
it's so interesting. There's so many interesting facets, and I'm really curious how you were able to choose which poems to feature in the book, because he was prolific. He wrote a lot more poems than would appear in this book. You had a great team, it sounds like, at Isobara Press, who were
yes.
helping you get the right tone and everything. And you also made some choices about how to translate and how to show the censorship. Can you talk about the censorship a little bit?
Yes. Well, first about Isobara Press. Again, I'm glad you mentioned this, because the publisher of Isobara Press is Paul Rossiter, who is himself a poet. And it's a wonderful little publishing house that produces poetry by poets who are interested in Japan, relate to Japan, live in Japan, are Japanese. So it's the link between Japan and poetry. And so it's a wonderful collection. And Paul Rossiter was very helpful, helping me, shaping these poems into English. That's the first thing, because English is not my native language, even though I love poetry. But, it was very good to have someone who was actually a poet helping with this. About the language, yes, there is censorship involved, because this was in the 1930s, when any mention of the emperor, for example, any criticism of the emperor, any criticism of private property was frowned upon and was censored by the government, or self-censored, because the poets or the writers knew that they would be censored if they didn't self-censor themselves. So this was a time where all leftist ideologies like communism, anarchism, and socialism were heavily repressed by the government. So authors like Sarashina were quite careful. They would put, instead of some words that could be offensive, they would put some little circles, the fuseji, in order to show, to hide the words. So in some cases, instead of the word emperor, you would have a little circle, oppression, or any criticism of private property was censored. So we did, when we did the translations and put it into English, you've got to make a choice. Either you pretend it's not there, or you replace by what you think could have been there. Sometimes it's obvious, but it's not always entirely obvious. I mean, there's a huge context. I mean, context that you have to be aware of, and you could miss the mark. Or what we did, we just put it into brackets. We put the word censored, which I think works in this case, because it actually makes it quite powerful, because you realize that the writer, even though he's sympathetic, even though he has his own opinions, is not allowed to express them. And this is clearly, shown by these brackets and censored. So that was one of the choices we had to make. Another choice we had to make was about the use of onomatopoeia, which is very common. Japanese is not the only language, of course, that uses onomatopoeia, but it is true that it is many poets in Japan use them a lot, and there are quite a huge number of them available in the Japanese language. And Sarashina was keen to use them. Also, when you talk about the natural world, many of these poems are about the natural world. You want to, this is a wonderful way of expressing these phenomena of the natural world. And so we just wondered how to translate that too. And because it is a little bit distinctive in the case of Sarashina and that kind of poetry, we decided to leave the words in Japanese and gloss it immediately after with the equivalent meaning in English. So somehow it does disrupt a little bit the flow of the poem. But again, I thought that it's a really nice way of showing to someone who's not fluent in Japanese the beauty of the language, because you've got these frogs doing koro koro. A few little examples like that you really want to show.
For example, maybe for the censorship part, probably the most famous example is from Isn't It So? And so in Isn't It So, he's talking about you people descend from those long ago resisted the censored. But all you do is cry yourselves to sleep. The natives' censored law is poison gas. And you wonder what the point of clenching your fist is. Your balls cut off by the drinking shochu, your Minoko daughters stolen. So there's some really powerful parts of the poem which you keep that word censored in. And I think when I was reading it, it seems even more powerful then, that you realize not only this is a very honest reflection of how the locals were feeling in his poetry, but that any words or reference to officialdom or government was censored. And it's amazing actually that they allowed it, even with the censor, that they allowed it to be printed.
Well, they allowed it up to a point, and then when through the 30s, repression, censorship became more and more stricter, and then it in the end nothing was allowed. I mean, during the war, nothing was allowed anymore. But in that particular poem, there are so many aspects of Ainu history that come into that poem. For example, he says, you who have long resisted its cause is the emperor. That is because the Ainu were originally living in the mainland, and they were pushed by the Yamato people, the Japanese people up north, and ended up living mostly in the northern part, and so, but they were. It didn't happen just smoothly. Of course, they had some battles and some conflict in the past for several centuries until in the late 18th century. Finally, it just settled down somehow. And then in 1869 there was the actual incorporation of Hokkaido into Japan. So that part, is the emperor. And then it mentions this law. This is a law of 1899, which is called the Former Natives Protection Law. So in this case, I think there's a little bit of a pun on protection. So that the Japanese government established this system to allow the Ainu to receive land in exchange of actually cultivating the land. And of course, in all process of expansion and settler colonization and colonization, you want to cultivate the land, because that's the way to to occupy it. It's the best way to occupy it, basically. So they were trying to motivate the local Ainu to cultivate land in exchange for owning the land. But there were, of course, several conditions, and as in all these processes, doesn't always go so smoothly and so fairly. And that was one of the problems. So the Ainu were not necessarily happy with that law, even though the intention was to protect them, and you've got to put some quotation marks here. So that the Ainu, for example, were complaining that they would receive the worst land compared to what the Japanese would receive. So because this cultivation system applied also to Japanese, but the Ainu, would sometimes receive much worse land than the Japanese themselves. So that was one of the complaints. And then you mentioned also the sake, the shochu, the fact that they, instead of fighting back, at least that's what Sarashina's view is, they would fall into drinking shochu and lose all their fighting spirit, But if you compare the conquest or the incorporation of Hokkaido to the conquest of the Midwest in the United States, conquest of the West in the United States, there are similarities, but there's one big difference, of course. It was very peaceful comparatively in Japan. There were hardly any, if any, armed conflicts at that time anymore. So the Ainu communities basically accepted more or less the situation, which I don't think it was the case in America earlier, of course. But
yeah, I found that really interesting, and he was obviously very sympathetic, and he ended up losing his teaching job because he kind of rebelled against the curriculum that was forced on, even though the Ainu children were segregated into different schools, they were forced to relearn their history through a Japanese government filter, right? So
yes,
the children were being told different stories than their ancestors had told them. And they would ask Sarashina-san, is this true about my ancestors? And he was very conflicted about forcing that kind of changed history version on his students, and he ended up being dismissed from the school for that rebellion. Is that right? So interesting.
Yes, that's right. And there's this particular poem which you're referring to, where a little girl is reading the government-approved textbook, and it says that the Ainu, well, it implies that the Ainu were the emishi, were the basically the tribe that had to be pushed away, that they were not the original occupants, that they were outsiders, and that had to be pushed out. And so that, of course, that conflicts with what they thought of the land, the Ainu Moshi was the land of the people that belonged to them right from the start. So Sarashina was very critical of the educational policies of the Japanese government, and as you say, he ended up being dismissed from his job because he had opposed and openly basically critiqued this view of the government and the way the Ainu children were taught this history. They're very
which wasn't easy, because he himself was struggling to make a living, and in the book he writes about talking with his mother, and he was telling his mother, "Don't cry for me, like I'm okay. I feel okay with my decision to kind of rebel against them." And in your introduction in the book, you write about to him, Ainu civilization was other, but never inferior. And so he was proud of kind of standing up for his principles in that way, maybe?
Yes, this idea of having a scale of civilization, some are superior than others. That was very much into the Japanese mindset at the time of the Meiji Restoration, and the everything that came with it. And it's a long story, of course, but for the Japanese at the time to have the Ainu as a so-called backward civilization, it had their own self-perception and how they would be able to catch up with the so-called advanced civilizations of the West. And of course, we've changed completely our views on this today, finally, and happily. But it is true that in the case of Sarashina and many people who he was acquainted with, his friends and activists, there was much less of a sense of the Ainu having living in a backward time, and much less because I say that it's never entirely avoidable, actually. That Sarashina was also a Japanese, as his mindset slowly, and particularly when the war years came closer, he changed his views a little bit. I think he was partly forced to do it because his wife had died. He had 2 little girls. He had to feed them. So he tended to support, not very openly, but sometimes, writing supportive poems, supportive of the war effort, for example. I think somehow he felt forced to do it. But on the other hand, yes, it was very difficult to remain completely neutral and an outsider. And he did fall into the category of intellectuals who slowly turned a little bit their coat, we say, and supported the Japanese government. After the war, he actually had a long career as an ethnographer, historian of Ainu traditions, and he stayed very close to many Ainu communities, but some other Ainu were quite resentful of his actions because they thought that he had used their, the Ainu concept almost to advance his own career. But that's another story, really, and it has to do with identity politics and all these things that are very difficult to understand sometimes and to grasp, certainly.
Yeah. I just want to touch on this other part from your introduction where you talk about Chiri Yukie, who was also writing at that time. She was a celebrated native Ainu who transcribed traditional tales into Japanese, and she expressed astonishment mingled with anger about the vocabulary of disappearance attached to her people. So there were other writers at that time who maybe were kind of pushing back against the idea that Ainu culture is no good and it's disappearing. And she wanted to, maybe other people as well, wanted to perpetuate and keep alive the Ainu culture and traditions. And even now in 2020, 2021, we see the struggle kind of continuing even now. So it's still a relevant issue, right?
It is still a relevant issue. And Chiri Yukie, or Yukie Chiri, was a very interesting young woman who died very young, actually, because she transcribed the Ainu and then translated into Japanese. Because there's one thing we have to keep in mind, that the Ainu have no written language. So everything has always been transmitted through oral traditions, which, of course, is a completely different concept again. And these traditions, were very often transmitted through what they call yuka or kamui yuka, which were songs that told stories, either epics or the songs of the gods. And what Chidi Yukie did is transcribe and then translate into Japanese some of these kamui yuka, which are lovely, and these kamui yuka, in fact, are those when the gods talk in the first person and explain what they see and how, and the gods in the Ainu world, of course, are all these natural phenomena and even house implements that facilitate life of the humans. And so there's a kind of constant communication you see between the world of the gods and the world of the humans. And the gods facilitate the life of the humans, and in return the humans pray and thank the gods. So there are quite some rituals and ceremonies in order to make this interaction always in process, if you wish. So yes, these stories, these Ainu stories, there are quite a few now that have been transcribed, recorded, even translated, and that are available in Japanese. There are a few translated into English, and it's lovely. These lovely stories, but they do belong to a dying tradition, if you wish, which is sad. But it's I think that instead of seeing it as a disappearing race or a disappearing tribe, it's more important to look at it as some intermingling of cultures. And the Ainu and the Japanese culture, Ainu and Japanese culture somehow have met, and some new things are coming out of this. And you can never really preserve or conserve a culture, without any influences from the outside. I think it's these days it's almost impossible. So it's the Ainu traditions are very rich, and I think we can still enjoy understanding them and see how they have come in contact with the outside world in a very meaningful way, actually.
Yeah, beautiful. I had a chance to talk to a filmmaker, Chuck Bisher, in the series so far, and he did a documentary about a young Ainu woman who was revisiting her heritage and history and learning these songs, like you're talking about, and learning how to sing it, and then traveling to America and visiting indigenous culture groups in America who had similar stories and similar heritage and similar traditions, which were kind of restricted by the government. And that was a really interesting talk. And yeah, and then having that background and knowing that conflict to embrace your heritage for the Ainu people is still definitely happening. It's still a struggle. You talk about in your introduction, you say, to Sarashina, this intriguing and powerful symbolism also pointed to the plight of a people who found it difficult to confront the modern world because of deeply held beliefs. And he saw their deep cultural heritage as one of the reasons they were having so much difficulty kind of becoming modern Japanese people, right?
Yes. So they had these ceremonies, and one of the famous or the most well-known one is the Iomande, is the sacrifice of a bear cub. And, as I said before, it is a ceremony to thank the gods for having facilitated life on Earth for the humans. So the gods come to the land of the humans in the shape of bears, so the the skin can be used for clothing, and the meat can be eaten, and so forth. And so there's one ceremony called Iomande when the Ainu return the bear to the land of the gods, but that means a very elaborated ceremony with the bear cub and so forth. And Sarashina thought that, of course, these ceremonies are interesting in themselves for what they tell us about the Ainu world and their conceptions and so forth. On the other hand, to keep believing in the 20th century, because that's when he lived and documented these things, keep believing in the need to do this was perhaps something that was a break to integration into the modern world. And he was, as I say, ambivalent about those traditions and beliefs, and he called them superstitions. So superstitions has always a little bit of a negative meaning to it, I think.
Yeah, but it also seemed like he was very intrigued by their way of thinking because of it, right? Like in your book, you translated the poem Bear Story, and it's about an old man talking about a story of a bear stealing a calf and having a very surprise ending, because when he followed the bear, who he assumed had killed the cow, he noticed the bear was actually nurturing and cuddling the cow. And he was really surprised. But then he said, now I see, I understand what the bear was thinking. And the bear walked off and the calf followed it. Like, he's just kind of appreciating nature on a different level. And then he says, but I can't live with bears. In the end, it's delightful. I love it.
Well, yeah, I think that these poems, by going into the Ainu's worldview, and the way they relate to animals and to the animal world, I think it makes you reflect a little bit on this conception that is part of modernity, which is, man has to control nature, and nature is there to be controlled. And there is some kind of separation between humans and animals that is a given. And I think that, now we think, of course, we think a little bit differently, because we tend to return to a more flexible conception of the man-nature relationship. But I think that at the time, it was certainly on the part of a poet like Sarashina is some form of critique of blind modernization and blind, destruction of natures and all these traditions that were linked to nature and therefore allowed a more harmonious connection, more harmonious connection between man and nature. And yeah, I'm talking here in broad terms because, of course, it's always a little bit more complicated. But I think these poems were a little bit of a wake-up call in that sense, and the world of the animals could not just be dismissed and put aside. I mean, there's a very sad story, representative story of the eradication of wolves in Hokkaido, because the Japanese had decided to invest in cattle ranching, and therefore the wolves, the native wolves, were very dangerous. I mean, they used to kill the cows and the cattle, and therefore there was a campaign to eradicate them, and they did eradicate the native wolf of Hokkaido. So this was perhaps some critique of those kind of methods that were so radical and so definite in a way, and harmful in the long run.
Yeah, and I think we see that not only in Japan, but quite often all over the world, how the occupiers would try to make changes which seem logical and seem more efficient, but pushing the indigenous people to give up their connection to nature and their connection to the animals and hunting and gathering and even practicing their beliefs as the gods coming down as the animals to provide food for them, like very different concepts about the balance between humans and animals. I thought that was really interesting. You also share some folklore. So, for example, on the lake and the story of the old woman and her tears, and so in the book there's also some delightful stories which represent Ainu culture in terms of passing on these stories, and the story represents how nature creates rain or mist in a certain area that they live in. I thought it was so beautiful. It's like traveling to Hokkaido as well.
Well, as you probably know, there are beautiful landscapes in Hokkaido. I think one of the stories referred to this Lakematsu, is it? Which is a crater, basically a very deep crater, and there's a tiny little island in the middle. You can't really access it because the access is so abrupt, and then there's this tiny island in the middle, and the Ainu have given it some meaning. It's always spiritual meaning, which is what makes a community like that live and perdure basically in time. So it's some of these stories are lovely indeed.
It's beautiful. And when I visited, like you said, when I visited Hokkaido years ago, and my children love snowboarding, and we were in this beautiful area, and I remember waking up really early in the morning to go and watch the sunrise. And I had my camera and I was taking photos, and I just, in my periphery, I thought somebody else was standing next to me taking photos, and I look over and it was a Hokkaido fox that was standing on the hill next to me, and he's looking at the sunrise next to me, taking in the sunrise. And wow, that was so powerful, to just be in such a natural place. I loved it.
Yeah, they are beautiful places out there. I mean, almost everywhere, but if you can connect these places to the people who've lived there for a very long time and their stories, I think it makes it sometimes even more meaningful, or at least enjoyable. Yes.
And was it 2016 that you had a trip to Hokkaido to go and research more before writing the book? Is that right?
Yes, I went there in 2016, and you know what I like to do when I read poetry is to really go on the steps of the poet. I think it makes a huge difference. And of course, this happened 100 years ago, so things have changed. But I was taken to the forest, and I traveled in the mountains and went to the little village where he lived. So some Ainu village that had been preserved, and then I also met his son, and we had a conversation, and it really, it's a way of contextualizing, but I think it's a way of visualizing what he was seeing, or what is left at what he was seeing. It makes a big difference, I think, when you write a book or where you translate poems like that, and it was very helpful and quite interesting. I've done something similar with Miyazawa Kenji, following his steps of travel in Tohoku. I mean, much less in depth, and I'm not a translator of Miyazawa Kenji, but it was also, these poets did wonderful journeys. I mean, we can go back to Basho, and the journeys they did, traveling by foot very often, through the countryside and through the villages, and then they write their impressions, and they resurrect basically the the mists and the scent and the atmosphere and the encounters too, because it is always very often it is very often a story of encounters with different people and different situations. Yeah.
So I think you talk about this in the interview you did with Japan Times years ago when the book came out. You're talking about going to the museums, and maybe on that visit, you not only visited the areas, but you were also able to see more information in different museums. Was that in Hokkaido?
Well, there is in Hokkaido, it's near Abashiri. It's called the Museum of Northern Peoples, which I highly recommend to anyone who ever has a chance to go up there. And it's about the cultures of different indigenous tribes who lived in the north. So that includes the Ainu, but I think there are perhaps 7 or 8 other indigenous peoples living in the Kamchatka Peninsula, in the Inuit, and they're comparing the way they make things, what they eat, how they relate to the environment, and it's very well done, and it's really enlightening to see how much of a common ground there is between these different peoples, but also differences and specificities. The patterns on the clothing, and it's a wonderful museum, really. I loved it, and again, it makes you understand how so much of a special world it was in the north, and because all these people, of course, had to deal with the snow, the snow and the cold, which is always a huge part of daily life, and how they did that. So that's really interesting. And there's quite a bit of literature about indigenous peoples in the north, and one thing we also have to understand is that now we talked about the Ainu, and we talk about the Nivsks, and we talk about other different indigenous peoples as if they were separate entities. But in fact, of course, they had a lot of exchanges between each other, including intermarriages. So it's much more of a fluid situation, interaction between people existed, and it's a fluid phenomenon of indigeneity rather than a set and solid, separate little worlds like that. And I think that's important to understand too.
Yeah, wonderful. Just a shout out to people watching from Facebook and YouTube and Twitch. Thank you so much. And feel free to write your questions and comments. We have about 7 more minutes, so we'll try to fit them in if you write anything. Nadine, can you tell us if you have a favorite poem or a favorite part of the book that you kind of stayed with you all these years later?
Well, there are parts that I really like. For one thing, the poets are put into some kind of chronological order. So the ones at the end of the book are those Sarashina wrote a bit later, and he's changed his mind already a little bit about what to think about all of these changes taking place. And so the ones at the end of the book are more abstract in talking about Ainu stories. The one at the beginning of the book really almost impersonate Ainu in their daily life. And so I like those particularly. I like one poem when he talks about being a teacher with little children, and it's summer, and all the children say, "Oh, can we go out and have a swim after that?" And he says, "Yes, wait. And then finally they all go out and they rush to the lake, and they all take off their clothes and jump into the water. And he ends the poem saying, and they all were standing there, naked in the air, and they said, sensei, come and jumping with us. And I thought it was such a wonderful, feeling of summer and being together in the water. There's another poem I really like, but that's also because I'm a historian and I'm interested in these things that document other aspects of history. And there's one about the Russo-Japanese War, actually. One Ainu participated, he took a Japanese name and participated in the war as a soldier. And what he reports is not bravery, is not heroism, it's more how prisoners were, dispatched to the other world because it was too difficult to keep them as prisoners. It was about, as I say, lack of bravery rather than the other way around. And so that's always interesting to see it that way. But it's not as enjoyable, I'd say.
But still very relevant and very important that you've documented it in English. Now you talk about English is not your native language. Are you native French speaker?
Native French speaker, yes. And
have you thought about translating this into French, this book?
Well, I would like to actually write more in French that and other things. Life sometimes takes you into the non-chosen path or the by chance I joined a British university and so did my PhD and this and that, and so that's why I ended up writing this in English. But you're right, I think it's worth translating into as many languages as possible, actually, because it's a world, as I said earlier, it's a document on the world at the time, Hokkaido, 1930s, this interaction between Japanese and Ainu in an incredibly changing environment and wonderful, beautiful landscape, actually. And this is, it's an interesting document.
Yeah, I would say so. And it's such an important document in history, but also in keeping these Ainu stories and traditions and experiences with the Ainu from this time, keeping it alive in modern history for modern people to be able to read and experience and relate to. I grew up in Hawaii, and there's so many similarities between the indigenous Hawaiian people and what they were forced to change when, well-meaning occupiers came in and told them, don't farm like this anymore, don't hunt and gather, you have to change your way of living. So many parallels. And I'm sure anyone living anywhere in the world where there is indigenous cultures, there are very interesting connections in your book here. So it's a wonderful book. Thank you so much for writing it.
Well, thank you for the invitation to talking about it. I've been doing other work recently, so it was a little bit at the back of my mind. But going back to it today, it's actually it's really lovely. Thank you. It's wonderful.
That's great. We have just a couple more minutes. When you have a chance, do you teach some of the things from the book to your students in the UK?
Yes, I do teach. Students in the UK, I mean, my students are not that interested in poetry. And I think that, students these days don't find poetry that exciting unless they're really keen right from the start. So it's sometimes a little bit difficult to transmit the value of this poetry. But I'm a firm believer, actually, in the value of poetry as document, as inspiration, and that just the beauty of it. And I think that it should be part, actually, of the curriculum. Not only that poetry, but there are so many poems and just if you want to teach Japanese history, there's so many poets that have expressed, the mindset of their times, and the frustrations, the angst, the beauty, in such interesting ways that I'm very keen to do it. So I do a little bit of it, but I just can't overload my students with that kind of material, sadly.
Well, I hope that you'll join us again someday and give us more insights into the other work that you're doing as a historian of Japanese culture. This is so important, not only about poetry, not only about the Ainu's history, but so many different ways to talk about shared experience in Japan is so connected to sustainability and how we should move forward and make better choices in terms of protecting people, protecting the planet, and having a strong economy is really important to have that balance. Thank you so much.
It was a real pleasure, and I really hope we can connect again in the future. Thank you so much, JJ.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining. Sarah said she just tuned in now, looking forward to watching it. Yeah, please do the replay. It will be available on YouTube and Facebook and Twitch, so watch it anytime. And make sure that you write your questions and comments, and we'll try to reply there as well. I know Nadine is also on Facebook. Maybe if there's interesting questions, you can also reply there. Thank you so much, Nadine. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.